parents taught money in a deeply physical and practical way in the 1960s, and if you lived through that era, you remember just how real those early lessons felt. A child didn't learn about money from diagrams, charts, or big explanations. They learned because they watched it happen right in front of them. Money was handled. Money was touched. Money was sorted out loud at the kitchen table. It didn't live behind a screen. It didn't hide inside a number somewhere in a system. It sat in a jar. It sat in envelopes. It sat in your hand. Picture that kitchen. The table was formica, chrome trim shining a little where sunlight touched it. The refrigerator hummed in the background. The curtains were simple cotton, not stylized or themed. There might have been a cup of instant coffee nearby, next to a folded newspaper, and at the center of the table a jar of coins. Maybe a jelly jar that had been rinsed and repurposed. Maybe a metal tin that once held coffee. Families didn't waste containers. Almost everything could be reused. When money came home, it didn't immediately disappear into digital space. Bills and coins were poured out visibly. Quarters, dimes, nickels, pennies, each one in its own little shape, each one with its own weight. And children learned the value of each piece simply by holding them. A quarter felt heavier than a dime. A penny felt warm if it had been in someone's hand too long. Money wasn't just an idea. It was sensory. Sometimes a parent would pause with a small stack, not to dramatize anything, but to make sure the amount felt intentional. And every child recognized that moment. The slow movement of the hand, the sorting, the little slide of a nickel across the table, the quiet words, "This is for groceries," or "This is for later," or sometimes even "This is yours." Those were not dramatic speeches. They were small sentences, but the small sentences taught more than lectures ever could. Kids saw money enter the house and kids saw where it went. They saw which part went to groceries at the neighborhood market. They saw which part stayed in the jar for the weekend. They saw which pennies were saved for something that mattered later. Children didn't need to be told how money worked. They were surrounded by visible proof. Money wasn't a topic. Money was a moment. And those moments stacked inside memory, coin by coin, teaching slowly, quietly, effectively, without ever calling attention to themselves. Outside the home, money education continued in everyday life, almost without anyone realizing it. Children in the 1960s didn't learn how money worked from theory. They learned it because the world itself was structured around coins, small payments, and visible exchange. You could walk into a grocery store, see the prices with your own eyes, and understand instantly how close or far you were from what you wanted. When a child walked into Woolworth, the world was inviting, not overwhelming. You could smell the popcorn from the front counter. Toys were not behind glass like unreachable treasures. They were right there at hand level. Small bouncy balls in bins, tiny metal toy cars arranged neatly, crayons and coloring books stacked in a simple wooden display. If you had a dime, a nickel, and 2 pennies, you could buy something. When you approached the counter, you didn't tap a card. You placed coins down one by one. The cashier counted them out loud. The clerk handed back change in your palm. You saw the subtraction happen in the real world. This built confidence. A child who paid for their own treat understood cost. A child who waited to save for a small toy understood patience. No lecture needed, just life. Outside in the neighborhood, money also came through opportunity. Children gathered empty soda bottles, placed them into a bicycle basket, then rode down the street to return them. Just 3 or 4 bottles could lead to a few coins. Returning bottles wasn't business. It was simply understood as something you could do, and that effort earned reward. Kids learned quickly that not all coins felt the same. A nickel had more weight than a penny. A dime was light but valuable. Even school carried small transactions that taught money without trying. The school store might sell pencils, erasers, or small sharpeners. You'd line up, wait your turn, and hand over coins. Milk at lunch cost real money, and children made decisions, save the coin or spend it. Those tiny choices created familiarity with limits, not because someone demanded discipline, but because reality provided it. Even simple play involved money logic. Trading marbles or baseball cards taught negotiation. Kids understood that scarcity changed value. If everyone on the playground wanted the same card, a tops player card with a popular athlete, the excitement around it created its own little economy. Children discovered that sometimes value wasn't in the price printed, but in desire. These outdoor and public interactions with money were layered on top of the household routines. Learning was happening from every angle, in the kitchen and in the world. And children didn't even know they were becoming financially aware. They only realized it years later. Inside the home, the deepest part of money learning came from the rhythm of weekly routine. Saturday afternoon was especially meaningful for many children in the 1960s. It had a pattern, a flow. Nothing rushed, nothing chaotic. Saturday was when the family paused, reset, and sorted out the week's money with calm intention. The table was cleared first. The radio might have been playing softly in the background. A bowl of apples might have been nearby. And then the envelope or jar came out. Not for show, but because this was simply how things were done. Bills were unfolded and smoothed. Coins were separated. Change from earlier in the week was placed in a pile. There was no mental accounting. No quiet private digital tab running inside a phone. Everything happened out loud, in the open. Children didn't sit at the table like students. They sat like observers of real life. Parent might say, "This pile is staying home. This is for groceries. This is for the week. This is for the future." Not dramatic, not heavy, just steady. And in those small words, future wasn't something big. It didn't mean a decade from now. Future meant next week's need, or a bigger weekend treat, or a small item someone was waiting for. Felt real. Sometimes a mother would slip $1 or $2 into an envelope for her own little secret project. New dish towels, ingredients for a special recipe, something thoughtful for the home. Sometimes a father would tuck small bills into a wallet and say quietly, "This is for gas," with a tone that wasn't anxious, just firm and aware. Children studying those moments learned that money wasn't supposed to vanish accidentally. Money was supposed to be placed, assigned, directed. If a penny rolled away, someone would reach down and pick it up. No one dismissed small coins as worthless. Even the smallest amount held meaning. And the most powerful teaching moment of all was when a parent slid a small amount toward the child. A quarter placed in front of you meant trust. 2 dimes meant decision. A nickel meant possibility. That tiny gesture, sliding a coin, felt like the entire adult world opening a little door. You held the coin in your palm, and the weight was more than metal. It was responsibility. It was choice. It was freedom, but a gentle and controlled kind. That physical moment is what stayed in memory. Not the speeches, not the explanations, but then the world began to move faster. Slowly at first, so slowly that many families didn't even realize what was changing. New payment methods arrived. At first, they seemed harmless, just one more convenience. A store had its own charge card. A department store offered a line of credit. Then banks began sending out plastic cards. Balances became numbers printed on statements instead of bills sorted into envelopes. And bit by bit, the way money was experienced shifted. Money stopped sitting on the kitchen table. Bills were no longer laid out to be touched. Coins no longer held the center of the conversation. People didn't stop valuing money, but they stopped touching it. A parent could now pay a bill without ever seeing the money leave their hands. A child could grow up without knowing how many coins or bills made up a purchase. And even though families still cared deeply about budgeting, planning, and spending wisely, those lessons no longer happened in the physical world. They weren't absorbed through fingertips. They weren't passed through the eyes and ears. Teaching started happening in conversation instead of demonstration, and demonstration had always been the strongest teacher. Children lost the natural show, don't tell experience. Instead of seeing money arrive and leave in a real, grounded way, they heard explanations about money that floated in the air, but didn't connect to something physical. Money shifted from hand to system, from jar to account, from coin to number, and the change didn't feel dramatic at the time, but looking back, people sense how different it was. In the 1960s, money had texture. Coins had temperature. Bills had corners that softened with use. Saving meant watching a jar slowly fill up. Spending meant hearing coins scrape against one another as they were dropped into a cashier's hand. When that vanished, something quiet vanished with it. Not dignity, not values, not discipline. What disappeared was contact. The connection between effort and reward became less visible. When money became silent, the teaching of money became less natural. It required words, explanations, lessons, instead of ordinary life itself revealing the truth. That subtle shift is why people who lived through the 1960s still say, "We learned about money differently." Because they didn't learn money like a subject in school, they learned money like a physical language. When people from the 1960s think back on how money felt then, what comes up isn't the exact prices or the exact numbers, it's the calm, the steadiness, the clarity. There was no mystery about how money worked. It wasn't a fog of numbers hidden behind screens. It wasn't a cloud that updated silently while no one was looking. It was something you could hold in your hand, something you could count out loud, something you could place in a jar and watch grow, little by little. And because of that physical reality, children understood money not as theory, but as something with weight, sound, and consequence. Even now, decades later, the memory is not abstract. It's not conceptual. It's sensory. People remember the way coins sounded when they were poured out onto the table, that bright metal jingle. They remember how bills felt when they were smoothed out flat with the palm of a hand. They remember the warmth of the kitchen light, the quiet of the moment, the seriousness in a parent's expression. Not dramatic, just present. As they showed their children, without speeches, how money needed to be handled. They remember saving for something small, but meaningful, like a toy car or a pack of baseball cards. Waiting, adding coins little by little, feeling the tiny victories of choosing patience over impulse. That feeling shaped them more deeply than they ever realized at the time. And they remember that money wasn't feared, it was respected. It wasn't something to hide. It wasn't something to avoid discussing. It wasn't something the adults handled in private. Everyone saw how it worked. Money in the 1960s wasn't just a tool, it was a ritual. It represented effort because money came into the house slowly. It represented care because money was placed with intention. It represented values because money wasn't rushed or wasted. When people look back now, they don't say money was easier then. They say something much deeper. Money made sense. Because the teaching wasn't theory, it was lived experience. And the body never forgot it. Even today, if a person who grew up in the 1960s picks up a coin, they don't just feel metal. They feel memory. They feel that small childhood moment when a parent slid a coin toward them. Not as a gift, not as a bribe, not as a treat, but as a tiny piece of adult responsibility placed into the hands of a child who was being trusted to learn. That was the legacy. Small coins, small gestures, big understanding. And that understanding carried forward quietly into a lifetime.